Yes, hello everyone. US politics impacts to Europe very much, and so we carefully watch it. And now we have seen that there was a problem when it came to the election of the Speaker of the House of Representatives because of internal conflicts within the Republican Party. Now there is a speaker, Kevin McCarthy got re-elected, but it was quite different. So I learned that the highest number on ballots until a speaker was elected was 169 somewhere in the 19th century. Gavin Wax, president of the Young Republicans Club of New York City. Great to have you here. How many ballots it took today, and maybe you can explain us why it took so many.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on, Dr. Craw. And you are correct that this was a very interesting process in the U.S. that doesn't happen very frequently. Kevin McCarthy required 15 ballots over the course of 4 days to be elected Speaker. This broke many records. You have to go back before the Civil War to see a period of time in U.S. history when a speakership was so hotly contested. But he is now set to become one of the weakest speakers in American political history, having to make many concessions to a block of about 21 voters, 21 representatives in the House conference in order to secure his speakership. But overall, I think that this was a positive development. I think that this was very productive. I think that the battle showed that the right wing of the Republican Party is serious, that they are willing to fight to get concessions, to get changes, to fight for their beliefs and principles. And it also shows that a minority within a much larger conference can wield power effectively to influence change. So what we're seeing happening is a radical transformation and reformation of how Congress does business. Tonight, the Congress is set to vote on the rules package, which is the rules that will govern the House of Representatives. And this was part of the deal struck between McCarthy and the 20 holdouts. And these rules are fundamental to reforming D.C., to draining the so-called swamp, and to restraining the power of the speakership, turning it almost into a ceremonial position. So overall, I'm very happy with what we saw, and it's a very positive development for the Republican Party and conservatives here in the United States.
But now maybe come back to explain what is the position McCarthy stands for, and what is the critics on this position? So where would you see is the major difference between McCarthy and what we call the conservative part of the Republican Party, of those who would have preferred to see another speaker?
McCarthy stands for nothing besides McCarthy. He's looking out for himself and the lobbyists that he serves. He is a longtime swamp creature. He has risen the ranks of the Republican Party apparatus for decades. This has been his prized goal to become speaker, and it was his own shamelessness and his own pure lust for the title, for the crown, for the position of speaker that enabled him to concede so much ground, because they knew that he would do anything to become speaker, even if it means surrendering many positions, surrendering on many other policy areas, surrendering in many areas that would give him power as long as he actually gets the title. So for that, he was actually perfect for this sort of political play. But the opposition has been very clear. They would like to see the way Congress does business change. They would like some basic common sense reforms, like having a single item be addressed in each bill rather than having omnibus bills, lowering the threshold to remove a speaker from 5 to 1, allowing Congress to fire federal employees, establishing a church committee which can investigate the politicization and the weaponization of different government agencies such as the FBI, bringing to the floor votes for funding a border wall to stop mass migration, bringing to the floor votes to fund that wall, and also to discuss term limits, allowing people allowing members of Congress to bring votes to the floor easier around the committee process, handing out committee ships and committee gavels to more conservative members. I mean, the list goes on. There were many concessions given, and I think Representative Matt Gaetz put it pretty bluntly when he said, we simply had nothing else left to ask of him. We asked everything and we got everything. So McCarthy's side wanted to keep the swamp, the machinations of the swamp continuing to serve the interests of their lobbyists and their deep state backers. And the conservative opposition wanted to see reform in how Congress handles its business, both in terms of rules, but also in terms of legislation being brought to the floor. So all of these developments are positive, and we're still getting intelligence and details about the package through the press, but the full details have not been totally available yet. But tonight we should have a full grasp on how the entire package will look, and I am pretty confident that it's going to be historic in terms of what it achieves for the American people.
So if I watch to the US or if I talk to DC people, then what I realize is there are kind of two schools within the Republican Party. There are this a little bit old style Republicans. For them, frankly speaking, tax cuts is the mean to reach everything. Yeah, so you have a social problem, tax cuts are, you need more growth, tax cuts, etc., etc. And then I meet with some, let's say, younger persons, and they tell me, no, we are in a cultural war, we have social problems, we have to keep the country together, united with one identity, and we want to use the political authority and the state even to reach those cultural, social, political aims. So you can say between a classical conservative agenda among the younger and a more libertarian agenda among the older Republicans. So would you say that McCarthy is more libertarian, or is he just completely free of any ideology?
In the U.S. context, I would label McCarthy more neoliberal or neoconservative. I think the libertarian label in the U.S. has connotations about being very anti-war, anti-foreign intervention, which certainly McCarthy is not, and his cohorts are not. I would argue, in fact, that there were many people that could be described as libertarians in the holdouts, but there were also populists. It was actually a very ideologically diverse coalition that opposed him. I think some of them could be described as libertarians, some of them could have been described as traditional conservatives, some of them could be described as populists. I think that the opposition to McCarthy were largely moderates, were largely the liberal wing, the neoliberal wing, the neoconservative wing. But the thing about McCarthy is that he's just not ideological. He's an empty suit. So he's not even necessarily principled ideologically in any context. He does what he has to do to serve his own interests, to serve McCarthy, and to serve whoever happens to be backing him at any given time. But this entire challenge to him served to send a message to the establishment that the things that McCarthy did in the lead up to this vote will not be accepted again. And McCarthy had a very heavy hand in the primary. He directed funds to defeat populist and anti-establishment candidates in the primaries. And in many cases, when those candidates happened to make it out of the primaries, he then abandoned them in the general. And these tactics that were being used against members of his own party because he wanted to get rid of opposition votes against him and only support loyalists, this cost us many seats in the House, and many people were discussing, well, why was it that Republicans failed to achieve a majority, a much bigger majority than many people were expecting? Well, you can point it to McCarthy's leadership, where he was selectively using funds to destroy Republican candidates, conservatives, populists, who he knew would not be voting for him for speaker, while supporting people that would be loyal to him. And those decisions cost us many seats across the country and divided our resources and pit us against one another. And one of the concessions that McCarthy was forced to make, one of the early concessions, was that he would be prohibited from doing this. He used a certain fund called the Congressional Leadership Fund to funnel money into these races and direct them against his political opposition. But McCarthy knew for months that he didn't have the votes. He knew as early as October he didn't have the votes, but he was arrogant and he refused to negotiate. And when Monday started, he was still refusing to negotiate. And it took him getting embarrassed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rounds before he started to really come to the table and make some serious concessions. Ultimately, many of the people would have liked to have seen a different speaker, which could have happened had McCarthy been a little less shameless. But at this point, if he is ever to go back on his word, if he were to betray the promises that he made, he would be removed from the speakership in a heartbeat. And it's very possible that within a year, he could be removed from the speakership, possibly the next time a Ukrainian bill comes up to vote for spending, or another omnibus, or another type of big bloated piece of legislation that he folds on. And were that to happen, I think he would be removed that time around. But I think there's many people who realize he's weak. He's going to be unable to control the conference. He was unable to whip the 20 votes for the span of 4 days. So this is a very weak ceremonial speakership. And the people that are really in charge right now in Congress are the 20 conservatives plus some of their other colleagues, led by Matt Gaetz and others, who are really holding the gavel in a theoretical sense.
I mean, you mentioned Ukraine. What is interesting for us is, would you say that the Republican Party will continue with that policy to focus on the rest of the world, or is there a hope that, or maybe an expectation that the party comes back to the Trumpian view to say America first, and let's focus on our infrastructure, let's focus on our industry? So because you spend a lot of money for sanctions and for wars all over the world. Meanwhile, Germany is part of that trail, and our energy prices have increased by the factor of 4. So for European conservatives, especially in Germany, we of course hope for an end of sanctions and for more peace. But now it's the Biden administration that pushes us into that conflict, and that is avoiding peace negotiations. So the question is there a rising share of the Republican Party that would change that, I would say, more or less aggressive policy to come back to a more consensual style or looking for diplomacy? Or would you say, no, we have to be aware that both big parties in DC will continue that very tough course against the Russians?
I think it's the momentum is certainly shifting. The odds are, I mean, as it stands now, the bulk of Republican leadership and Republican electeds are very disconnected from their voters. And I think on many issues, including how we handle foreign intervention, how we handle our diplomacy, how we fund all these foreign interventions in Ukraine or elsewhere, I think the vast majority of Republicans are very much opposed to this sort of thing, to this sort of policy, to this sort of spending. But the problem is Republican elected officials and Republican leadership are so out of touch and disconnected from the will and the views of their own voters. And I think that this was shown by the speakership race in and of itself, because McCarthy has something like a 20% approval rating among Republicans, yet he had 90% of the conference on his side. I think that disconnect could only go on for so much longer. And I think having a very public spectacle like we saw with the speakership really shows the Republican voters just how out of touch and out of sync Republican leadership is with their base. They'll talk about Reagan talking points. They'll talk about, this sort of empire building, this nation building, this sort of neoconservative view of foreign policy. But that's not what the Republican voters want. They want a more Trumpian style, America first foreign policy agenda that puts our interests first and foremost. I do think this is changing. I think slowly with every election cycle and the primary season, we're seeing many individuals get elected into the House and into the Senate who hold these views. I just think right now the United States as a whole is experiencing a period of political realignment. It's a political realignment nationally, and it's a political realignment within the Republican Party itself. And we're seeing it shift to the right. We're seeing it shift in a more populist direction. And these things take time. And if you look at historically in the Republican Party, going back, say to the 1960s, 1970s, at the very beginning of the conservative revolution with Barry Goldwater, it did not finalize until the election of Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And that was replacing the old Rockefeller liberal Republican wing of the party. And that took about, 2-3 decades. And right now we're still living under this zombie Reaganism, this sort of neoliberal agenda from the 1980s. And it's going to maybe take a few more decades or a decade or so to fully pull us out of that and move us more into a Trumpian style Republican Party. So the realignment is slow. It's a little staggered. It takes time, but I think it's happening. And I think the speakership vote is sort of the pivotal moment to show how the party is beginning to shift, and how, even if it hasn't fully shifted, how a minority within the party or within the party's elected officials in the House, that minority can successfully wield power to advance an agenda. I think it's a very good precedent to set, and I think it shows that there's a path forward in future intra-party style fights and negotiations.
I mean, this is a very optimistic view. When I come to your club in New York City, then I would say with one sad exception, everyone shared your view and your optimism. If you look into the whole country, would you say that everyone in the younger generations of Republicans is holding this, I would say, more traditional conservative populist agenda? Or are there still young people who support the more uni-party establishment way of Republican politics?
I mean, it certainly can be skewed depending on what your sample size is. I mean, there are many young people that work in government, in politics, who work on the Hill, who work for elected officials, who are staffers, who work for the apparatus and the infrastructure of the party. And they're a very small subset, and they're going to tell you, oh, no, we love McCarthy, we love the establishment. They are uni-party people because they're being groomed to move up the ranks. But that's a very small subset of the youth. I think the bulk of the younger conservatives, younger Republicans, such as myself, are very much moving to the right. They're very much moving to the populist side of the party. That's where the energy is. That's what you see on social media. That's what you see in these organizations, such as my own club. That's what you see happening. And even if you look at the elected officials that are shifting the party right, many of them are on the younger side. They are these younger mavericks, so to speak, that are sort of leading the charge. And it is these people like McCarthy and others who are sort of holding the party back. So if there is an age divide, if there is a generational divide, it is certainly on our side in terms of where the youth stand. And I think that paves the way for what we're going to see in the future. And I think some people, even in the establishment, realize this. If they're able to look at trends and they're able to look at the progression that we're seeing, they realize that they're clinging on to an outdated form of Republican politics that's slowly fading away. And it's only going to be a matter of time before this inevitable emerging populist majority takes control of the party and hopefully a governing majority of the country, and can lead us to a national renewal, which is what many people are hoping for. Because right now, what we're seeing out of the Uni Party, as you said, is a managed decline of our country, and it's slow and steady. And the only difference between either wing of the Uni Party, the Democrat establishment or the Republican establishment, is the speed in which they are willing to go in terms of this managed decline. Republicans want to just go a little slower in terms of the establishment, and the Democrats want to, really just pump the pedal, so to speak, and go off the cliff. So that's really the only meaningful difference between either establishment wing, and that's why it's very important to have these intra-party victories in terms of securing leadership, because sadly the Republican Party as an institution is the only vehicle and means by which to fight back against this politically in the United States, and that's why these fights are so crucial and important.
I thank you very much for sharing those insights. We have to restore Western conservatism on both sides of the Atlantic. Even there might be some differences, but the way and the enemy is the same. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time, and I hope we can continue our conversation in person soon here in Brussels or maybe in New York City. And I wish you good luck. I say, as far as I can say this as a foreigner, you fight the right fight. And I hope that we can inspire us on both sides. And at least I can guarantee you that not only me, but even our viewers are now better informed and smarter than they were before we started our talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. 𝐊𝐵𝐚𝐡. Much appreciated.